actually in Spain. He's trained in Spain, and he's currently doing his doctorate, his PhD, in the economic sphere. So Sifiso has great knowledge. He's great. He's well known in the media space. He writes his own column in a couple of newspapers, and he has also been heard many times on ENCA and Newsroom Africa, Kaya FM on the radio. So he's very well spoken, and he's very, very knowledgeable. So you're going to hear from him now. Sifiso has joined us. Sifiso, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Gary. How are you doing?
Good, and yourself?
Good.
Sifiso, are you going to give us a wrap of the economic situation this week, and just give us a few things that happened, a few big highlights for the week?
No, absolutely. I thought actually let me share my screen and reflect on the recent report that we published, and we'll see if we're able to get through it as quickly as possible, so that after 30 minutes we can get into a Q&A type of discussion, so that people can then get a sense of where we are and how we're transitioning across the various alert levels in terms of the lockdown. I think just to confirm, is everyone able to see my screen that I'm sharing?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So I think this week has been, an interesting week in the context of what's been happening. Where we got the, announcement that the country will be moving to level 3 across the board, and that there are various hotspots in the economy that may have restricted movements, but we don't know if those will actually stay at level 4 or not. And then subsequent to that, we also heard around, the participation of churches back into the main, mainstream, participation. And of course, then that's, riled up a whole lot of, responses. Particularly, we heard from, the restaurant business, and they said, well, if churches who aren't necessarily, contributors to the economy from a fiscus point of view, they're allowed to operate, and why aren't we all allowed to operate? And of course, we understand that also British American Tobacco is taking government to court. They've revived their application to fight around the issue of cigarettes. And I think, before we get to the report itself, one of the questions that I was asked in an interview yesterday was, what are the opportunities that government might have missed from a sectoral point of view in their consideration around what part of the economy to open or part of the economy not to open. And my first response was that probably the biggest thing that they have missed is certainly the information opportunity. And when I say that, is that all the way from stage 5 to now, the imminent stage 3, we haven't, I guess, been lucky enough to get to a point where we get the right level of granularity in the detail that informs the choices that government makes. And so when government initially opened up cigarettes, it would have been interesting to see how they got to that answer. And when they chose to say, for example, 50% of mining companies must be in operation, what made them get to that particular number? Why not 40? Why not 60%? And what are the mechanics that inform the imperatives that we're trying to achieve by doing such a thing? And I think what's happening now with even the issues around the churches, etc. And interestingly enough, some of the big church church groups have come out and said that they're not promoting any participation from their members, and that members must still stay away, primarily because they are of the view that it's not going to help the health issue in the context of the economy, given the restrictions or the implications from a social distancing point of view. And so I think, we certainly are amidst the right level of communication, the right level of transparency around the things then that ultimately inform the policy choices that we make that have got material economic implications. So then so getting into the report itself, we spent some time just trying to see what was in the market, and how were we talking about, the COVID impact at a sectoral level, and what we ultimately got to is that a lot of the conversation was, talking around, big expectations or big numbers coming out around what GDP expectation will be, but nothing was getting to the detail around what will inform whatever GDP number was coming out as a forecast. And so what we then, sought out to do was to first give you that level of detail and say, these are some of the things that can inform whatever GDP outcome that could materialize. We are in a space where we're observing data points on a daily basis. And so it is certainly more prudent to run scenarios around, if this happens, then we can expect these kind of outcomes, than to put your stake in the ground and saying this is going to happen. We are certainly learning as we're going from the data that's coming in. And, and so one of the interesting questions then was around, which sectors have been able to operate in a COVID impacted economy, and what do we have the opportunity to learn from that? I think interestingly, I've gotten a lot more solicitations from the Herbalife guys, and it seems like then that there's still a booming market in the Herbalife space. The crypto traders and the binary traders have been quiet of late. I suspect that they're also taking a bit of a beating, and they don't know how to sell us, the cryptos. But kudos to certainly the resilience of the Herbalife, runners on the ground. Those guys are truly committed to economic prosperity for this economy. So there were two reports that we found quite interesting in our understanding, in our also surveying of the landscape. There was one from Stats SA, which was looking at, surveying number of businesses on how they were impacted during the course of the lockdown. And we also saw then a collection of academics contributing a piece of research to National Treasury. And our view is that, often we don't, we must leverage body of knowledge that has been created and try to enhance it. And so there's certainly some really nice things that we learned from both of the reports that we did include in our report. And also we also did some interesting comparisons around what were each of the reports finding versus what we were modeling on our side. Simply, businesses are of course under a lot of stress. Close to 90% of the businesses, this is the Stats SA one, surveyed, were expecting a reduction in their turnover. And interestingly enough, then 50% of the businesses thought that the access to funding facilities would remain the same. And what we also saw was that half of the businesses expected their workforce to stay the same, while 36% expected a decrease. And I'll go through quite quickly then, how we went off to pretty much figure out how to compare some of the findings here. And the GDP in South Africa, 60% of it is attributable to household income. And so we thought the two ways to look at this thing is that, one, there's going to be GDP leakage, or there's going to be output loss by virtue of the fact that households are going to be stressed. So people are going to lose their jobs. Some people are going to be working on reduced hours. Business profitability is going to be low. And therefore, household income is going to be low. And therefore, GDP is expected to be low. And so the first thing we modeled then is to say what's the level of economic activity that was taking place at each sector, and what's the potential then for that to have an impact in terms of what would happen in terms of household expenditure, what's the expected drop in household expenditure. So at a stage 5 level, we saw that we would have about a 42% decrease in household expenditure. And that goes all the way down to about 6% decrease in household expenditure at stage 1. And interestingly enough, when we looked at the report coming from National Treasury, they also modeled about a 40% decrease in output at a stage 5 level. We then went on to then model on our side and say, well, what do we expect from a GDP point of view on a quarter-on-quarter basis, and what do we expect from a GDP basis on a year-on-year basis? And so our findings is that given the trend that's happening, that government is reducing the lockdown levels each month, we expect then the GDP shortage or the contraction in GDP to be as high as 33.8% in the second quarter. And that's quite material. But I think what's even more interesting is that we saw the South African Reserve Bank come back and revise their growth expectations. They had initially come in at a 6.1, and they're now expecting the growth of the economy to contract at 7%. Our expectation is that the economy is going to contract at 17.9%. And one of the I guess tools that we use when we assess the relationship between employment outcomes and output in South Africa is something called elasticity. And we find that in a South African context, the output to labor elasticity is close to 1. And what that means is that generally there tends to be a good tracking of what happens to GDP, particularly on the downside, will happen to employment outcomes. And so you'd see very close to 17.9 reduction in the 16 million people who are currently employed. And that pretty much amounts to close to about 3 million people that we expect will be out of a job by the end of this year. And so that's quite a stark number to, I think, reflect on, and certainly what the implications may be. And what we do then in the report is that we really get into detail from a sectoral point of view for you to be able to see is that where we expect these contractions to come. And so I'll just stay on this page and I'll talk around it. So we know that there were certain sectors that were able to operate at a hard stage 5 level. Agriculture is one of those. But again, not all agriculture is created equal. We know that the winemakers fought really hard to be able to export wine. And therefore, that portion of horticulture certainly took a bit of a beating. But outside of that, the meat and the field crops in agriculture were still operational. We were still able to export out of our borders because agriculture is an essential good. And so a lot of the impact that we'd see in agriculture would largely be driven by just the contraction in demand. Remember, I said that household expenditure is expected to decrease at 42% at a stage 5 level and all the way down to 6% contraction at a stage 1. And therefore, households' ability to consume and spend was certainly impacted, and it would probably quite closely track what happens in an agricultural context in terms of what the impact that we're going to find in that particular sector. What was quite interesting in thinking about a lot of the choices from a government point of view was in mining. They, initially at a stage 4 and 5, particular stage 4 level, they said open cast mining can operate at 100%, and underground, or in essence, where you had to sink a shaft, that could only operate at 50%. The implication is, from our point of view, is that they didn't do enough work to understand the complexity of the market that they're dealing with. Once you've sunk a shaft, for example, you can't decommission 50% of that shaft. And the implication, therefore, is that there's certain sectors that can't operate at 50%. And so when you think around your policy choices, around which portions of the economy do we open and which portions of the economy don't we open. It's certainly quite critical to understand the model, the operating model of that particular sector and subsector before then you ultimately say that sector can operate at 50%. And in South Africa, and again, I think what's quite an interesting one about mining specifically is that the largest contributors to our earnings from a mining point of view is the platinum group of metals. And the PGMs are made up of platinum, palladium, rhodium mostly. And platinum is used for jewelry as well as autocatalytic processes in diesel car manufacturing. Rhodium and palladium are mostly used for autocatalytic processes, which is in the diesel manufacturing process, car manufacturing process. And then outside of that, we've got gold, which mostly goes into reserves, it goes into ETFs, it goes into jewelry. And then from there, we've got coal. We saw Eskom initiated the force majeure for the coal sector. In essence, that's them saying that we will not be able to deliver against our contractual obligations to purchase as much supply as we had initially contracted. We heard from Andre de Ruyter, the CEO of Eskom, saying there was about 7,500 megawatt excess demand or excess supply of electricity in the marketplace. What that means was that that's roughly the size of our alternative energy offering in the economy, which is mostly made up of wind energy. So it was by no surprise then that force majeure followed into the alternatives energy space, and then Eskom went to them and said, we can't promise that we'll procure all of the energy that you guys are producing. And so just going back to coal, and so that means again in the coal sector that there's a suppression in the level of the output that can happen given the constraints from a demand point of view that's happening in the economy. When you then think about, and then the last one is manganese, and manganese is probably the one mineral in the country where we can broadly do, it's mostly on open cast mining, and that's used in the chemical processes as an input into that, as a carbon input into the chemical processes. And so when you think about then car manufacturing and platinum PGM group of metals, you think about jewelry and gold and PGM group of metals, those are all, I mean, we saw a 98% decline in car purchases in the economy. And of course, you'd expect that purchases in jewelry would certainly also take a tanking. And so that means that the demand for these commodities would certainly remain suppressed for some time. And that would be pretty much the things informing the context of the GDP suppression coming out of the mining sector specifically. I think what was then a lot more interesting was in the manufacturing space, many contentious issues that came out there around e-commerce, textiles, and a whole lot of the, subsectors within there that were initially not allowed to operate. And the question was, why? And I think we certainly didn't get a satisfactory answer from policymakers around the restrictions, the initial restrictions they had for textiles, for rubber, and a whole lot of other subsectors in manufacturing that were deemed non-essential and therefore couldn't operate, yet they lend themselves particularly to being able to operate within the confines of social distancing and not materially exposing people to health risks. And so that was, of course, quite a contentious issue. And ultimately, government came back and said, well, at least online retailing can come in. And that, of course, comes under the trade subsector. And again, another opportunity they missed there is that initially they had said that online retailing or e-commerce can't happen at full steam because it would result in the disadvantaged people remaining disadvantaged. And we know that what happens in crises is that inequality exacerbates and poverty incidence also gets worse. And so in essence, what they were saying is that people who don't have access to certain supply chains wouldn't be able to participate economically, and only those who would have that access. Well, the question is then kind of, you've got the legislative arm, make that sector more inclusive, and so create the space and create legislative rules and guidelines that will show a minimum participation for certain sized, small-sized textile operators in the economy. And as I said in our previous conversation around the context of textiles in South Africa, is that the biggest issue was that we never had the opportunity to build economies of scale. And so our textiles is not broad enough and deep enough in terms of the manufacturing capacity. And so we're unable to compete on price in a global context. Now we're seeing deglobalization, forms of it at least taking place, and therefore we have to insource some of our supply chains, and textiles is one of those sectors. So there's certainly an opportunity now for government to think around what does it mean to build scale in textiles to ensure that when we get back into a really globalized global economy, we can compete on price as well. So that those were some of the things that went into the complexities in manufacturing, and I'll get into the view at a sector level. And so this is the kind of approach that we did in the report, is that we'd look at and model the kind of subsector participation that was possible at each of the levels. And so you could see where it's red, that in essence would speak to the extent of the kind of losses that companies would experience due to inability to operate at that level. And you see how that changes over the alert levels. I think what's quite interesting here is then also looking at the potential for the job leakage. At the top end, at a sustained stage 5 or level 5, we could have seen up to about 981,000 jobs in this lost in the sector, and best case scenario would see about 263,000 jobs lost in the sector. But based on the fact that we are transitioning across the various levels, our base case then is that there's probably about 500,000 jobs that are going to be lost in the sector over the year. And this is certainly problematic given the fact that manufacturing and the capacity in the economy has been declining over the last 24, 25 years, and manufacturing has become a smaller contributor of GDP. And so, but what this does, I think, it certainly enables policymakers to start to see the implications of certain choices and say, if we stay at level 3, what is the potential impact on GDP? If we accelerate to level 2, what potential gains might we realize? And so that was specifically manufacturing. Wholesale was a very interesting one. Primarily because vehicle sales were not allowed at a stage 5 and a stage 4 level, and hoteling and restauranting was not allowed to operate. And so we saw retail shops allowed to operate, again, with certain restrictions, because initially there were certain non-essential goods that they were not allowed to sell, and only as of last week, and we're hearing that all clothing items, etc., will also be able to be sold in this particular space. And so this sector is one of the largest employers in the economy, and when we model the impact in this particular sector, given the extent to which hotels and restaurants will still not be able to operate level 5, level 4, and level 3. And we're seeing also that dealerships are only allowed to operate at 30%, but now also people will certainly be trepidatious in terms of deciding whether to buy a new vehicle or not. And even if you look over the last 10 years, actually, South Africans have certainly started moving towards keeping their cars longer. And so there was one study that showed that on average, the average age of cars now in the country was between 7 and 10 years. So people are keeping their cars for longer, and some of those who are in the market for new cars were going for second-hand cars. And so that second-hand market had been a lot more interesting than the new vehicle sales. And so we start, through this particular lens, then we can see, where some of the operators are able or will be particularly hit, given the pandemic. And this sector for me was quite an interesting one, primarily because if we look at the structure of the South African economy, it's an economy that tends to be dominated largely by big firms. To the extent that there were, in the December tax statistics, there were about 814,000 companies that were assessed for tax, and only 25.4% of those reported positive profits, in essence that they paid tax, and only 380 companies contributed to 57% of the tax revenue. I repeat that, 380 companies, and those were in essence companies with earnings over or taxable income over 200 million. 380 companies contributed to 57% of the tax collection from corporate income tax. What that means is that this whole idea of companies being too big to fail is certainly problematic in a South African context, because there's systemic risk that becomes inbuilt into the system. Because once you have an organization as big as Edcon, 90-year-old business, I think it had about 25,000 permanent staff and 10,000 non-permanent staff. When that kind of business goes into business rescue and does not foresee the possibility of them being able to operate sustainably, the impact from a jobs point of view is catastrophic. And so, the thinking then from a policy making point of view is that when we want to reimagine this economy, we've got to think around what does it mean to make the economy more inclusive for medium-sized businesses and small businesses, to be able to reduce the systemic risk that we find here. That when one big business comes under amount of stress, the implication for the economy at large is catastrophic. And so that's really the thinking around this particular sector. We know the financial services industry has broadly been able to operate at in a COVID impacted economy, and a lot of the inability to operate was largely because of the services in engineering services and manufacturing services. But broadly speaking, finance and legal and accounting have been able to operate, and the GDP leakage there would also be categorized by the inability of other companies to operate. And so if you're doing, for example, a consulting job for a particular company that can't operate, and then they would necessarily freeze some of their contracting as well. But I think, and you can go through the report and you'll see the level of detail that we go into, at each sector and subsector level. But I think, over and above that, there are then key questions that we must ask. And those questions are certainly around, what do we need to do now? And the starting point, again, is that the question is not lives versus livelihoods. That is certainly not the question. So, but rather is, how do we build productive capacity in a COVID-impacted economy in a way that promotes broad-based economic participation as well as sustainable development post-COVID? And by that, what we mean is that the earlier bit of work that was done was really a foot on the health accelerator. And we're not asking for that foot to be removed of the health accelerator, but for that foot to be put, for a second foot to be put harder on the economic accelerator. And so we make the example that there's certain sectors that we saw that are able to operate in a COVID impacted economy. And so, textiles, what does it mean for you to reinvest or to drive investment into that sector while we're still trying to figure out what to do with this COVID situation? That is a sector that can operate. We also saw a sector, for example, where we're insourcing now the importation of medical equipment, right? And historically, that market was controlled by three countries globally. 60% of the production, manufacturing of medical goods and equipment came from three economies. And now economies have had to insource that and make it internally. And that means that there's an opportunity for us to reinvest in productive investment in productive assets that will, increase our manufacturing capacity in the economy. And so, and so we get into some of the sectors that are interesting. And so I've spoken about e-commerce, but interestingly, warehousing is also one such sector. Will be quite interesting because when e-commerce is rising, the goods that you're procuring needs to be stored somewhere. Over and above that, there are a lot of companies that are preparing for the light to be switched on for their sector. And so there's been some stockpiling in terms of inventories that were unable to move. And so those inventories need to stay somewhere. And as a result, then the need for warehousing space is certainly on the rise. We've seen it go through the roof in the US, and we're expecting to see that, contextually also in a South African context. And then, of course, I've made the example around, building capacity in community. We understand that apartheid, particularly one of the things it had is that it resulted in spatial planning issues for the economy. And so the lowest earning income people in the economy need to take 3 taxis just to get to work. So there are sectors and subsectors that don't require them to be based in a Sandton, for example. And I've made many examples on how a call center could be moved to Soweto, and the managers who live in the suburbs who are driving against traffic there. But what you do is that by doing that, it means that you're investing in the township economy, and people don't have to travel as far, and that means they're most likely to be more productive, and they're using less money on transport, right? We know that there are about 15 million taxi rides per day in South Africa and about 900,000 bus rides. And so, and that's also got implications in terms of safety and a whole lot of things. And so, what does it mean for us to rethink the ideas around rebuilding capacity in the township economy? I also made the example with the beer situation when beer was not being sold. And I said, beer's got a short shelf life, but we've also got concentration in terms of companies who make bread in the economy. What does it mean, for example, for some of the bread making companies to think around opening up manufacturing capacity for bread making in Lokshini and procure some of the beer from the taverns, etc., to make beer bread? Right, we've seen the consumption of bread in South Africa decline over the last 10 years. I think we now consuming about 2.2 billion loaves of bread, and was I think about 2.7 billion loaves of bread about 2010. And that would mean that the economy is getting poorer because bread is the second most important staple in the economy. And so when you see declines in the consumption of bread, it's certainly something to be worried. And so what does it mean to build capacity in those economies? Not only does it improve the nutritional outcomes, but it also gets them bread at a cheaper price because the bread doesn't have to go through a logistical process. And so these are some of the thinking around then moving beyond just saying this is what's going to happen, or this is what might happen at each stage of the level of the alert levels. But it's now also saying, well, what are the opportunities that are available for policymakers to think about what it means to reimagine the kind of economy that we ought to operate in. And the last thing is that, when you're building an economy, you certainly got to build social resilience. And social resilience speaks to things like health outcomes, nutritional outcomes, educational outcomes, and vulnerability to issues of climate change and weather patterns. And there's been numerous data points pointing to the idea that a universal basic income in South Africa is appropriate. We, in 2003, went on to commission what was called the Taylor Committee, and they were then meant to study the landscape of social benefits in the economy. And they came back saying that a phased-in introduction of the universal basic income would be beneficial for the South African economy. And the very high-level thinking is that when people have money in their hand, they can discriminate around how to spend it. So when you're really hungry, you might buy food, and if you break a leg, you might choose to go to a specialist. And the point is that the ability to discriminate means that people are able to make the choices that are most urgent for them at that point in time. And broadly speaking, we've found better nutritional outcomes, better educational outcomes, better health outcomes, and better levels of entrepreneurial activity when there's an existence of a universal basic income grant. So we started thinking now, and we heard the Reserve Bank Governor, Lesetja Kganyago, also speaking recently that South Africa is overdue, and he's a banker, and they often don't like this idea of these socialist, kind of programs. But even he came out and said, actually, South Africa is really overdue a universal basic income grant. We've seen now this 300 Rand and 350 Rand as probably a means in which government can probably test the efficacy of a universal basic income grant. And now we're challenging them to use that opportunity to learn and study and see the potential benefit that it can have for South Africans. And I mean, with that, for example, people wouldn't have to queue for food parcels because they would have those monies being transferred into a post bank account. And you'll also then be able to drive a lot of the things you want to drive around digital transformation in the economy. And so that's certainly, the bulk of our thinking around also understanding the context of the problem we're in, but also being able to reimagine the kind of economy that will enable us to get to a sustainable growth path. And of course, one of the things I forgot in this conversation around social resilience is educational outcomes. The education challenge in the economy is multifold, and the education issue in KZN is not the same as the one in the Eastern Cape. But one thing for sure is that we understand that the outcomes for maths and science have been weakening across the board in every province. And so some of the thinking that we've tabled, for example, for policymaking is that why don't we start with having regional maths and science centers? And when I say regional, I mean it's location-based, and say this center will service within a particular proximity, maybe 10 schools. That enables then kids to be able to go, from their normal learning environment to go into those centers to accelerate the ability to become more proficient in some of those subjects. And so even the education issue, I think we mustn't be too quick to try and use one paintbrush to deal with that issue. It is textured and it is multi-layered. But I think that's one of the things that certainly could start to add the value in terms of how we improve the educational outcomes in the economy. And so this is really the bulk of the report. And I really encourage you to read it and to get to the the nitty-gritties of it. It doesn't paint a pretty picture of our economy at all, but it also doesn't paint a terrible picture in terms of what's possible for this economy, depending on the choices that we make. And so I think, from my point of view, is that we have right now the levers to be able to make the important choices that can certainly result in a reimagined economic structure that would be a lot more broad-based and a lot more inclusive, versus the old model of the economic structure that we've seen in the country that was certainly exclusionary. And that's where we'll wrap up the economic wrap up for the week, and then I'll try get to some of your questions in the chat, and you're more than welcome to keep them coming, and we've got 20 minutes to get through that, so that should be okay.
That was fascinating, Sophie. So thank you very much. I've got to just want you to unpack a few issues. Basically, what I saw, if you can bring up the slide with the red, where you illustrated the level 5 red color, and then all the way down to the green, I believe, in level 1, and that's a great way of showing how from the different alert levels, the economy started to reopen. And key sectors have been hurt, and key sectors will improve. And I think what really concerned me about some of your was your one particular slide with regard to iron, steel, metals, minerals, which have really been hurting. And these are key sectors in our economy. Yeah. And we're going to have to, with alert level 3 coming on the 1st of June, next Monday. Are we going to see an improvement there? And those are key sectors.
Yeah, I mean, so, the challenge, and it's important to note that businesses are not a switch that we turn on and off. There's a whole lot of things that motivate business owners and business leaders to make certain decisions that inform the level of economic output. And so if you don't know, for example, what kind of policy framework we're going to operate in and whether or not we may or may not go to level 4, that means there's certain investment choices that you can't make as a business. There's certain levels of inventory that you can't order given the level of uncertainty in your business. And so the option for businesses to be able to operate at a particular level doesn't mean that then we're going to accelerate very quickly to full production at that particular level. And so that's certainly the other, I think, lens of the challenge that is in front of us, is that businesses are very trepidatious in their thinking right now, and therefore they'll be as cautious as possible in terms of the operating and investment choices that they'll be making. And as a result, that may result in further depression in the demand side of the equation. And so some of those key sectors that you talk about are key, for example, in car manufacturing. And the kind of tanking we're seeing in that particular sector would certainly, be reflected in those numbers as well. So we certainly want economic activity to take place across all levels. But I think we also just need to think about what it means to be smart in prioritizing and pushing our effort towards certain sectors that can create some economic buffer given their ability to operate.
Just for those that are not experts on economics, am I right to say that alert level 3, 70%, if I can interpret your statistics, 70% of the economy will start to be operating from Monday? I mean, is that correct? Or is that not? Basically, you had a close off of the economy, or is it your GDP?
It's theoretically, it's theoretically 70%.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm saying that because of the choices that businesses need to make, and some of the businesses only being told, for example, they can operate at 50%. So some restaurants who don't have, for example, an ability to compete with food delivery may just not open. Given the fact that people can't sit in the restaurant. And so yes, they make food and they have an option of making food and delivering it, but they just won't open because for them it won't be cost effective. And so while those restaurants have the option to do it, they just won't. And so that's why I'm saying theoretically that's the level of economic participation you'll see, but it's certainly not going to be what you're going to see on the ground, given the uncertainty that we are seeing in the marketplace right now. I mean, in the US, just this week alone, they had 2.1 million jobless claims. They have had since the lockdown, more than 40 million people apply for unemployment benefits, right? And that's a developed economy. And businesses there are taking a beating. And so, we can't expect any less in the South African context. And that's why then businesses will be a little bit cautious in figuring out what does it mean for me to operate in this particular environment. And so those are some of the things then that, enable us, I think, to be able to see what theoretically the guidelines suggest that the economy would be at 70%, but it really won't.
Sure. We've got a question from Sesme Langer. So government has not applied the levels against the initial script. Level 4 was watered down. You've indicated that there's an expectation that this adjustment is expected to be one level down a month. Is this without recognition to the increasing infections? For instance, initial projections were that we would reach our peak around August.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer for the health part in terms of what are they modeling for health outcomes, expectations. I don't know what they are thinking around that, but this is exactly why I was saying it's so critical that we don't take our foot off the health pedal and rather we put it on the economic pedal and say, what are the sectors that are able to operate without increasing the risk of exposure. And again, something that's really interesting for South African economy is that if you look at youth unemployment is prevalent across all qualification levels in South Africa. And what that means is that the people who are actually the breadwinners in the economy are the people who are 40 and above. But they are also the people who are more susceptible to falling fatally ill to the virus. And so what it means is that there's actually a topside risk for the South African economy, given the fact that the economic agents right now are the older participants in the economy. And so this is why it becomes so critical to ensure you don't remove your foot off the health pedal, but figure out ways in which you become smart in putting your foot on the economic accelerator.
Yeah, there's another question. Do you think that the various pivot opportunities in the economy, based on the fact that government has a bit more ability to make changes under alert level 3, do you think there'll be some flexibility?
Pivot in what way?
Pivot with regard to opportunities for perhaps companies that didn't have their opportunities at level 4 or level 5.
So I guess I'll try to answer it in the various ways in which pivot could mean in this particular question. And so the first view is, I guess, would be pivoting in terms of the sector in which you're operating or the kind of goods and services that you're providing. And again, I'll be bastardized for using this over and over again. But one of my favorite lines comes from the Nokia CEO, who said, "We didn't do anything wrong, but we still failed. We still lost." And it talks to the fact that marketplaces are dynamic and they're forever changing. And so the onus is upon business owners and business leaders to be able to adjust and to be able to think of interesting and innovative ways to operate in changing marketplaces. And so that's the first onus that's upon business owners and business leaders right now, is just that you have to continuously look at ways to evolve with an evolving marketplace. Over and above that, I think we're in the context of pivoting and maybe the loosening in terms of which sectors are able to participate. We're seeing now that all construction is allowed to operate, for example. Initially, the guidance was that it would still be civil works only at level 3, and residential and commercial wouldn't. Interestingly enough, residential and commercial together makes up about 65% of the earnings in the last year in terms of construction works. And so it certainly didn't make sense for those sectors to be kept out of economic activity, also given the fact that it's a sector that's been in decline for 7 consecutive quarters. And so, and also a sector it's largely labor absorptive. The multiplier for construction, I think, is about 3.2. And that means that for every rand that you spend in construction, 2 rand something else goes into other portions of the economy. So it's a sector that's got a relatively high multiplier, and so it's very useful for the growth agenda. And so I think that's probably one of the sectors they probably also hit a bit of a snooze button on while they were making decisions around which sectors should and shouldn't operate across the various levels.
Yeah. Well, what are your concerns coming Monday with the move to alert level 3 that perhaps people should look out for?
The biggest concern is that the risk to alert level 4 is still quite high. I suspect, and the challenge also is that the portions of the economy that are hotspots right now are some of the biggest contributors economically. Gauteng contributes about 34%, and Western Cape about 12%, and in the Eastern Cape, Port Elizabeth or Nelson Mandela Bay contributes 1/3 of the GDP in the province. And so if those parts of the economy go back to alert level 4, it means economically the level of activity that can take place will become materially more constrained. And I think the effect will probably be more heartfelt than what we saw when we moved from stage 5 to stage 4. And so for me, that's probably the biggest risk right now. And also, I absolutely have to, be upfront. I think religious gatherings are certainly a big risk in terms of the infection outlook for the economy and the potential fatalities in the economy. And so I think those are some of the things that policymakers should really, really reconsider, given the state of our economy.
Yeah, I mean, you did allude to it at the beginning of the show, churches reopening, a concern obviously with regard to health. How does the houses of worship at all contribute to the economy from a point of view of an economist?
Sorry, ask that question again.
Yeah, I mean, as we know, houses of worship are reopening from this week. I mean, we know the health concerns around the reopening of churches, synagogues, house of worships for other religions, but what economic contribution do they make at this point?
It's hard to say, right? We understand a lot of religious institutions also contribute to social outcomes. And so some of them have got food gardens and soup kitchens and all of that stuff that are designed to improve the social resilience outcomes in the economy. But unfortunately, those are not reflected in the GDP per se, and so they would ordinarily be reflected as a consumption number. And so it's hard to attribute directly to the economy their particular contribution. But we do know that most religious institutions are public benefit organizations, PBOs, and those are tax exempt. And so they certainly don't contribute to the fiscus from a tax point of view. And so that's just one of the considerations. We also know that donations towards those institutions do attract donations tax, and that might be another secondary contribution to the economy. But outside of that, it's really hard to be able to attribute the direct contribution of these institutions to the economy.
Yeah. Then of course, in alert level 3, tobacco and cigarettes still remains, in terms of regulations, cannot reopen those industries. And of course, with regard to the fiscus and tax, that still remains, is going to impact our economy, isn't it?
Well, I mean, and this is, again, the importance of this very last chapter that we write around. The question is not lives versus livelihoods. Because, and as I said, is that when government brings us into confidence around the things that the data points they are observing, we don't know which empirical evidence that they're studying to inform whether or not, the consumption of tobacco products will worsen people's health outcomes or their health resilience in the effect that they're infected. So we don't know, because we've heard various versions coming from some professionals. For example, some researchers have said that the actual tar in the cigarettes actually lines your body and prevents the virus from actually hinging onto your body. And so I don't know whether truly that cigarettes do worsen your health outcomes. I'm not an epidemiologist or a health practitioner, but I think certainly government ought to have walked us along the journey around what sources of data are they looking at to inform that particular choice. What we do know is that most of the smokers haven't stopped smoking, and so they are getting their stuff from the black market. But also the black market is certainly under a lot more pressure than they've been before, because our ports are closed and a lot of the counterfeit goods would come in through the ports. And so while on the one side, the extent of the illicit trade is probably not as bad as it's historically been, but there's still illicit trade taking place. And in a pre-COVID economy, we used to lose, at a conservative number, about 100 million per day to illicit trade. And that was largely attributed to textiles, alcohol and tobacco products, and some pharmaceutical products. And so it certainly means that there's still a prevalence of that particular black market or illicit trade market taking place, given the restrictions on the sale of tobacco products.
Sifiso, thanks a lot. I see it's nearly 4 o'clock. I think we're going to wrap it up. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the webinar. We'll see you again next Friday. Sifiso's on every Friday, giving his economic wrap for the week. So please join us on Monday. We've got another great show, Business Rescue in a Nutshell. Then Tuesday's a big show. Martin Kingston, the Vice President of Business Unity South Africa, will be joining us on a webinar. Do tune in for that at 9 a.m., a change in time, not 10 a.m., but 9 a.m. with Martin Kingston, who's very closely aligned to the government, has a lot of discussions with them. So you don't want to miss that one on Tuesday. And then this week also, we're talking cannabis, the cannabis industry. So look out on our website, www.cobra.org.za, for that webinar coming up. Sifiso will join us on that. Thank you very much. Until next week, it's goodbye from the COBRA team. Cheers.